Every disaster begins before anyone realizes it has already started. At 14:05 on September 12, 1943, a German glider detached from its tow cable high above the Apennines and began a silent descent toward a mountain plateau that should have been unreachable. The pilots had no second pass. The landing zone was uneven, strewn with rocks, bordered by cliffs. If the glider broke apart, the mission ended on impact. Below them stood the Campo Imperatore Hotel. Inside, under guard, was Benito Mussolini. The operation had already reached the point of no return. Otto Skorzeny was standing behind the pilot, braced for impact. He was not in command of the mission on paper. He was not a pilot. He was not airborne infantry. But he was the reason the mission existed in the form it now took. Berlin wanted a man who would not hesitate, who would force outcomes if the plan began to fail. That man was Skorzeny. He was 35 years old, tall, visibly scarred, and already known inside the SS as someone who did not accept limitations. He had not risen through conventional channels. He had not proven himself in extended combat. What he offered instead was audacity paired with an instinct for pressure. He understood that modern war rewarded speed and spectacle as much as discipline. The gliders hit the plateau hard. One crashed into rocks and splintered. Others skidded to a stop within meters of the hotel. German troops spilled out immediately, weapons raised, moving toward Italian guards who had not been warned of anything beyond routine duty. No shots were fired. The Italian guards froze, overwhelmed by shock rather than force. Within minutes, German paratroopers were inside the building. Mussolini was found in a room on the second floor, isolated, pale and uncertain whether this was an arrest or a rescue. Skorzeny pushed forward, ignoring the command structure that technically placed others in charge. He wanted to be seen. He wanted Mussolini to see him. He introduced himself loudly, theatrically, as the man sent by Adolf Hitler. The message was simple and deliberate. You are not abandoned. The extraction was the most dangerous phase. There was no runway, no road, only a small liaison aircraft, a Fiesler Storch, capable of taking off in almost no space, but not designed to carry the weight now demanded of it. The plane was meant for one passenger. Skorzeny forced himself aboard anyway. The pilot protested. The aircraft was overloaded. The slope was short. Failure meant the cliff. Skorzeny refused to disembark. The Storch lurched forward, bounced across uneven ground, and lifted into the air just before the plateau dropped away. It cleared the edge by meters. Mussolini was gone. The operation, later known as Operation Oak, was an operational success of extraordinary precision and improbability. It restored Mussolini as a political symbol, if not as a leader. It embarrassed the Italian government. It stunned the Allies. And it elevated Otto Skorzeny instantly. From that moment on, he became something new inside the Third Reich. Not just an officer, a concept. Skorzeny was now the man who could reach anywhere, who could take anyone, who could violate assumptions that protected generals and governments alike. Hitler noticed, and Hitler remembered. Skorzeny was given latitude, others were not. He assembled special units without traditional oversight. He selected men based on nerve rather than rank. His missions would not be large. They would be precise, theatrical, and psychologically disproportionate to their size. He did not think in terms of fronts. He thought in terms of targets. The kidnapping in the Alps was not his most complex operation. It was his most visible. It demonstrated that Allied and Axis leaders alike were vulnerable not to armies, but to speed, deception, and audacity concentrated in minutes. From that point forward, Otto Skorzeny operated in the margins of conventional war. He planned commando raids, infiltration missions, and operations designed as much to unsettle as to destroy. Some succeeded. Others failed quietly. But his reputation continued to grow, fed by both reality and myth. To the Allies, he became a problem without a clear solution. A man who did not fit standard threat models. He did not command divisions. He appeared briefly, changed conditions, and vanished. To Germany, he was proof that initiative still existed even as the strategic situation collapsed. And to Skorzeny himself, the rescue of Mussolini confirmed something he already believed: that war could still be bent by individuals willing to ignore the rules that protected everyone else. The Alps had not stopped him. Nothing, he believed, would. The success at Campo Imperatore altered how Skorzeny was used and how he was perceived. He was no longer assigned missions through ordinary channels. He was summoned directly. Hitler did not ask for feasibility studies. He asked whether something could be done, and Skorzeny answered with methods rather than doubts. That relationship defined everything that followed. Skorzeny's units were expanded and restructured into formations that existed outside standard command logic. They trained separately, operated irregularly, and answered upward rather than outward. Their purpose was not to hold ground or inflict sustained losses. It was to intervene at critical moments where surprise could outweigh numbers. The operations that followed were uneven. Some were carefully prepared and successful. Others collapsed under the weight of expectation. What unified them was intent. Skorzeny aimed at nodes of control, leaders, bridges, communications, symbols. He believed modern war could be disrupted by removing or manipulating individuals at the right moment. That belief drove his next major operation. In October 1944, Hungary stood on the edge of collapse. Its regent, Miklos Horthy, was negotiating secretly with the Allies, preparing to pull the country out of the war. For Germany, that would open the southeastern flank and accelerate defeat. The response was immediate and personal. Skorzeny was sent to Budapest. The mission was not subtle. It did not need to be. Horthy's son was seized in broad daylight and taken at gunpoint. The message was clear and delivered without negotiation. Horthy resigned within hours. A pro-German regime replaced him. Hungary remained in the war. Skorzeny did not linger. He never did. His role was intervention, not administration. Once the objective was secured, he moved on, leaving consequences behind him rather than managing them. By late 1944, Germany's military position was collapsing on every front. Skorzeny's missions did not change that. But they complicated it. They introduced uncertainty. They forced the Allies to allocate resources to threats that were difficult to quantify. His most controversial operation came during the Ardennes offensive. Skorzeny was tasked with forming units that would infiltrate American lines wearing U.S. uniforms, speaking English, and sowing confusion. Bridges were to be misdirected, orders altered, panic induced. The actual effect was limited. The psychological effect was not. Rumors spread faster than the men themselves. American units began detaining their own soldiers over accents and baseball trivia. Command slowed. Trust eroded briefly, but noticeably. Skorzeny understood that confusion did not need to last long to be useful. It only needed to exist at the wrong moment. When the operation ended, Skorzeny was captured. At his trial, the Allies charged him with war crimes for the use of enemy uniforms. The case collapsed under precedent. The same tactics had been used by Allied forces earlier in the war. Skorzeny was acquitted. He walked free, unrepentant, unchanged. After the war, his reputation detached fully from the context that had created it. He became a symbol rather than an officer, a commando, a fixer, a man associated with operations that sounded implausible until they occurred. He lived the rest of his life in that space between history and legend. He advised foreign militaries. He moved easily across borders. He was sought out and avoided in equal measure. He never denied what he had done. He never apologized for it either. The rescue in the Alps remained the defining image, a glider landing where no landing should be possible. Guards frozen by shock. A dictator lifted off a mountain by force of will and timing. It was not the most important operation of the war, but it demonstrated something that could not be undone. That modern conflict no longer required mass to violate security. That leadership could be reached directly. That the assumptions protecting power were fragile. Otto Skorzeny did not win wars. He showed how they could be disrupted by a single man willing to move faster than the system designed to stop him. That disruption became his signature. Skorzeny did not operate long enough in one place to be measured by results alone. He operated just long enough to alter behavior. After his missions, procedures changed. Security tightened. Assumptions were rewritten. That effect often mattered more than whatever he physically accomplished. Allied commanders learned to fear possibility rather than probability. Skorzeny did not need to be present everywhere. He only needed to be believed capable of appearing anywhere. His name began to circulate independently of verified intelligence. Reports referenced him even when he was not involved. The myth began to outrun the man. Skorzeny understood this and did not correct it. He cultivated ambiguity deliberately. He allowed rumors to grow. He gave interviews after the war that were precise in detail and vague in motivation. He spoke about operations without emotional language, reducing them to logistics and timing. That tone made everything he described sound repeatable, even when it was not. In reality, many of his later missions were constrained by the same pressures collapsing the German war effort: fuel shortages, broken communications, inexperienced replacements. His units were never large enough to operate independently for long. They relied on surprise, and surprise was increasingly difficult to achieve as Germany's position deteriorated. By 1945, Skorzeny was reacting rather than shaping. His operations delayed outcomes but could not reverse them. He understood this. He did not pretend otherwise. His interest was no longer victory in the conventional sense. It was agency, the ability to act meaningfully even as the larger structure failed. When Germany surrendered, Skorzeny did not disappear. He surrendered openly, was interrogated extensively, and then placed on trial. The proceedings treated him less as a conventional officer and more as a test case. How far could irregular warfare go before it crossed a legal boundary? The answer, in his case, was unclear. He had operated aggressively, deceptively, and often theatrically, but mostly within precedents already established by other powers. The court could not convict him without indicting practices the Allies themselves had used. He was released. After that, his life followed a trajectory that unsettled those who preferred clear endings. He did not retreat into obscurity. He moved through post-war Europe and beyond, advising, training, and associating with governments and organizations that valued his experience. He was useful precisely because he did not fit into traditional categories. To some, he was a criminal who escaped consequence. To others, a soldier who exploited opportunity. To many, a relic of a war that had not fully ended when the shooting stopped. Skorzeny never reframed himself. He did not seek redemption or justification. He described what he had done and allowed others to decide what it meant. He believed history favored initiative and that morality was defined by outcome rather than intention. The rescue in the Alps remained the clearest expression of that belief. It was clean, it was decisive, it was contained. Everything after it was more complicated, more compromised, and less cinematic. But the lesson endured. Security based on remoteness could be breached. Authority isolated could be seized. And war, increasingly, would be decided not only by massed forces, but by small groups operating at the edge of legality and expectation. Otto Skorzeny did not invent that future. He demonstrated it. And once demonstrated, it could not be forgotten. What remained after the war was not clarity, but persistence. Skorzeny's career did not conclude with surrender because the kind of warfare he practiced did not end cleanly when flags were lowered. It adapted. It moved into quieter spaces where accountability was thinner and memory was shorter. He understood that environment instinctively. In the years that followed, Skorzeny became difficult to place deliberately. He lived in Spain, traveled frequently, and maintained contact with former officers, intelligence services, and governments navigating a new geopolitical order where deniability mattered as much as capability. He was not hiding. He was available, selectively. Stories accumulated around him. Some were accurate, others were exaggerated. He was said to have advised foreign armies, trained special units, and consulted on counterinsurgency and security operations. He did not confirm everything. He did not deny much either. The ambiguity served him. What distinguished him from many others of his generation was not ideological persistence, but professional continuity. He did not cling to a lost cause. He clung to a method, speed, surprise, psychological leverage. Operations designed to resolve situations before larger forces could react. The world he moved through after 1945 increasingly resembled the one he had anticipated during the war. Power concentrated in individuals. Security depended on assumptions. Distance was no longer protection. The tools had changed, but the vulnerabilities remained. Skorzeny watched that transformation without comment. He did not claim credit. He did not claim authorship. He recognized patterns he had already exploited once, at altitude over an alpine plateau where impossibility had been treated as a suggestion rather than a rule. The rescue of Mussolini continued to define him because it captured everything that followed in compressed form. A political crisis resolved not by negotiation, but by intervention. A symbolic leader extracted intact to serve a narrative larger than his actual authority. A small team achieving disproportionate effect by moving faster than systems designed to stop them. It was not strategy in the classical sense. It was disruption. That distinction mattered. Skorzeny did not believe wars were won by disruption alone, but he believed disruption could shape when and how wars unfolded, who spoke, who hesitated, and who suddenly found themselves exposed. By the time he died in 1975, the world had changed again. The Cold War had formalized many of the principles he had exploited informally. Special operations units were no longer anomalies. They were institutionalized. Targeted actions replaced mass maneuvers in certain contexts. Leaders traveled with security shaped by lessons learned the hard way. Skorzeny did not live to see the full evolution of that shift, but he did not need to. He had already proven its premise. That premises mattered because it stripped away a comforting illusion. That power could be protected by height, distance, or protocol. That authority was safe if isolated. That war belonged only to armies, not to individuals willing to act alone, or nearly so. The Alps had disproven all of that in one afternoon. Otto Skorzeny did not end wars. He did not decide outcomes on a grand scale. He did something subtler and more unsettling. He demonstrated that the margins mattered, that systems could be penetrated, that a single operation executed precisely could reshape perception far beyond its material effect. That lesson survived him. And long after his name faded into specialist history, the kind of warfare he embodied remained, not as exception, but as option. Once shown, it could not be unshown. By the end of his life, Skorzeny occupied an uncomfortable place in memory. He was neither a general nor a bureaucrat. He had not commanded armies or shaped grand strategy. Yet his presence lingered disproportionately, precisely because it was never fully contained by rank or outcome. He did not fit into post-war narratives that preferred clean divisions. He was not a repentant figure seeking absolution, nor a defeated one fading quietly into obscurity. He remained visible, self-possessed, and unapologetic, which unsettled those who wanted the war to end with moral symmetry. Skorzeny did not deny responsibility. He simply rejected the premise that responsibility required remorse. He saw himself as a technician of conflict, not an ideologue. He believed that effectiveness justified method and that judgment belonged to history rather than conscience. That position did not make him unique. What made him distinct was how early he understood the direction warfare was taking. The rescue in the Alps was not important because it saved Mussolini. Mussolini himself no longer mattered strategically. The operation mattered because it showed that political reality could be altered by spectacle, that legitimacy could be manufactured through action, and that perception could be changed faster than facts. Skorzeny grasped that instinctively. He did not wait for authority to create opportunity. He moved into the space where opportunity existed briefly, acted, and left before the system could respond coherently. That rhythm would define much of the irregular conflict that followed in the second half of the 20th century. He never claimed that this kind of warfare was honorable. He claimed it was effective. The Allies understood this too, even if they preferred not to say it openly. His acquittal was not an endorsement, but it was an acknowledgement that the lines he crossed were not his alone. The war had already blurred them beyond repair. In that sense, Skorzeny was less an anomaly than an early indicator. He represented the moment when modern conflict shifted away from mass and toward access. When the question became not how many divisions could be fielded, but who could be reached, when, and how quickly. His legacy is therefore not attached to victory or defeat. It is attached to vulnerability. The vulnerability of leaders, the vulnerability of systems, the vulnerability of assumptions that distance and protocol provide safety. The Alps had offered isolation, height, remoteness, security by geography. Skorzeny had treated all of that as theater. Once that illusion was broken, it never fully returned. Otto Skorzeny did not invent the future of warfare. He did not design its institutions or codify its doctrines, but he demonstrated its direction with a clarity that could not be dismissed. A glider landing where no glider should land. A dictator removed without a shot, fired. A system exposed in minutes. That was enough. History does not remember him because he was right or wrong. It remembers him because he showed what was possible when someone was willing to move faster than the rules meant to stop him. And once that possibility was revealed, the world could not pretend it did not exist. That refusal to pretend became his final contribution. Skorzeny did not leave behind a doctrine, but he left behind a discomfort. A reminder that security is never absolute, that authority is never fully insulated, and that the rules of war are often written after someone has already shown how to bypass them. The kidnapping in the Alps condensed that truth into a single image that was impossible to ignore. A mountain considered secure, a leader considered isolated, a landing considered impossible. Each assumption failed in sequence, not because it was poorly designed, but because it was designed against conventional threats. Skorzeny never argued that his methods should be universal. He argued that they were inevitable, that in any system built on procedures, someone would eventually test the gaps between them, that the more rigid the structure, the more valuable speed and audacity became. This is why his legacy unsettled even those who defeated him. He did not represent a defeated ideology so much as an exposed vulnerability. His operations suggested that no victory was ever complete, because the means to disrupt power were no longer limited to armies or fronts. In the decades that followed, governments quietly absorbed that lesson. Security expanded outward. Leaders traveled with increasing layers of protection. Remote locations lost their meaning. The idea that distance equaled safety eroded steadily. None of this was attributed publicly to Skorzeny. It did not need to be. He had already proven the point. Otto Skorzeny died without recantation and without celebration. He remained consistent to the end, which is often more unsettling than regret. He believed he had operated within the logic of his time and that history would sort the rest. History has done exactly that, but not in the way he might have expected. He is not remembered as a commander or a strategist. He is remembered as an operator, a man whose actions mattered less for what they achieved than for what they revealed. That modern war would increasingly belong to those who could act precisely, briefly, and without warning. That political reality could be altered by minutes rather than months. That security built on assumptions would always invite someone willing to test them. The gliders on the plateau did not change the course of the Second World War. They changed the understanding of what was possible within it. And once that understanding existed, it did not disappear when the war ended. It carried forward, quietly, waiting for the next person willing to land where landing was not supposed to be possible. In the end, Skorzeny's story does not conclude with judgment or resolution. It concludes with recognition of a shift that could not be reversed. The war that produced him ended in ruins and surrender. The kind of war he practiced did not. The rescue in the Alps was not decisive because of its target. Mussolini was already politically diminished, a symbol propped up by force. What mattered was the method. A small group, acting independently, exploiting speed, confusion, and audacity, reached into what was assumed to be a sealed space and removed a head of state without resistance. That image traveled faster than any communiqué. After that, leaders everywhere understood something had changed. Protection could no longer rely on geography or obscurity. Mountains, distance, and isolation lost their meaning. Security became a process rather than a location. The threat was no longer massed armies alone, but individuals willing to move through gaps before anyone recognized they existed. Skorzeny never framed this as progress or decline. He framed it as reality. Systems produce procedures. Procedures produce blind spots. Blind spots invite action. He positioned himself where those elements overlapped and accepted the consequences without hesitation. That is why his legacy remains difficult to categorize. He was not a hero in the conventional sense, nor was he a footnote. He operated in the narrow space between, where individual initiative intersects with historical momentum. He did not alter outcomes on a grand scale. He altered expectations. The Alps operation stands because it stripped away comfort. It showed that power could be reached directly, that authority could be seized without battle, and that the margins of war were often more dangerous than its centers. Once seen, those truths could not be unseen. Skorzeny died knowing that his name would persist unevenly, admired by some, condemned by others, understood fully by few. He did not attempt to control that outcome. Control, for him, belonged only to the moment of action. History absorbed him the way it absorbs all operators, selectively, without consensus. What remains is not a verdict, but a pattern. A glider descending where descent was not expected. A system failing not from weakness, but from assumption. A war briefly bent by someone willing to act before permission existed. Otto Skorzeny did not create the future of conflict. He revealed it early, and once revealed, it waited, no longer hidden by distance or tradition, for the next moment when speed would matter more than force and audacity would matter more than scale. That is where his story ends, not with the war, but with the door he forced open and left that way. What followed was not imitation in the open, but absorption in silence. Militaries rarely acknowledge where they learn their most uncomfortable lessons. They adapt quietly, adjusting procedures, expanding units, redefining threats without naming the moment that forced the change. Skorzeny's operations entered that silent space. After the war, no major power dismissed what he had demonstrated. They studied it, reframed it, and rebuilt it inside their own structures, stripped of its origin and ideology. The methods survived because they were effective, not because of who first employed them. His name faded from doctrine, but his logic did not. Special operations units became permanent. Targeted actions were formalized. Kidnapping, extraction, infiltration, deception, once treated as irregular, were normalized, regulated, and institutionalized. What had once required audacity from an individual now required authorization from committees. But the core idea remained unchanged. Reach mattered more than mass. Speed mattered more than frontage. Confusion mattered more than destruction. Skorzeny had understood this instinctively, before most others were ready to admit it. Yet for all the attention given to his technical influence, something more unsettling remained. His career exposed how fragile legitimacy could be when confronted directly. Mussolini's rescue did not restore Italy's military strength. It restored an image, briefly, and that was enough to alter political reality for months. That lesson did not belong to Germany alone. It belonged to anyone who governed. Power could be disrupted not by defeating it, but by touching it, by showing that it was reachable, that it could be moved, removed, or humiliated in full view of the world. Skorzeny's operations targeted that vulnerability long before it became widely discussed. He did not theorize it. He enacted it. This is why his legacy remains uncomfortable even now. It does not sit cleanly within moral frameworks or strategic evaluations. It sits in the gap between legality and effectiveness, where outcomes precede justification. He operated there without apology and without hesitation. The Alps were not a one-off anomaly. They were a warning delivered early. That war would no longer respect distance. That leadership would no longer be insulated by geography. That the decisive moment might last minutes rather than months. Skorzeny did not need to say this. The image of a glider landing on a mountaintop said it for him. He did not survive in memory because he was victorious. Germany lost the war completely. He survived because he represented a shift that outlived defeat, a change in how conflict could be conducted, perceived, and managed. When historians return to him, they often search for balance, to contextualize, to soften, to condemn. Those efforts rarely change the central fact. He did what systems were not designed to prevent, and once that happened, those systems were forced to change. That is why Otto Skorzeny remains relevant long after the uniforms, the flags, and the ideology that shaped him disappeared. Not as a model, but as a reminder that somewhere between rules and reality, there will always be someone willing to test how far power can be reached, and how fast. By the time Skorzeny's name began to recede from public attention, the conditions that had made him possible had already been absorbed into the structure of modern conflict. His presence was no longer required for his influence to persist. The methods had detached from the man. That is often how these stories end, not with disappearance, but with normalization. What once shocked now required protocol. What once depended on audacity now depended on approval chains and contingency plans. The margins he had operated in were no longer empty. They were mapped, staffed, and regulated, but they still existed, because they always do. Skorzeny understood this before most. He never believed that systems could eliminate vulnerability, only shift it, only delay it. He operated on the assumption that any structure built by humans would contain gaps large enough for someone determined enough to exploit. The Alps had simply been the clearest demonstration. He did not romanticize that moment later in life. He described it as alignment, timing, terrain, confusion, and resolve intersecting briefly. He knew that such alignment could not be manufactured endlessly. But he also knew it did not need to be. One demonstration was enough to alter behavior permanently. That alteration is what endured. After him, leaders traveled differently, guarded differently, hid differently. Security became performative as well as practical, designed not just to protect, but to reassure. That reassurance was necessary precisely because the illusion of invulnerability had been broken. Skorzeny never claimed responsibility for that shift. He did not need to. The evidence was embedded in how power began to move and protect itself after the war. Less visible, less isolated, less confident in distance alone. The rescue of Mussolini was never about saving a man. It was about proving that a man could be reached. That proof did not expire. As the decades passed and new conflicts replaced old ones, the pattern repeated in different forms, different uniforms, different ideologies, different technologies, the same underlying vulnerability. Someone moved faster than expected. Someone crossed a line assumed to be secure. Someone forced a system to react instead of act. Skorzeny did not invent that dynamic. He revealed it early, before the world was ready to admit it existed. And once revealed, it could not be put back behind the mountains where it had been hidden. In the end, Otto Skorzeny's significance does not rest on loyalty, ideology, or even success measured in territory gained or lost. It rests on exposure. He exposed how thin the line was between control and surprise, between security and assumption. The war that produced him collapsed completely. The regime he served was destroyed. The symbols he rescued lost their meaning almost as soon as they were restored. None of that altered the fact that the method he demonstrated survived intact. A mountain was not protection. Isolation was not security. Authority could be reached directly. Those truths did not belong to one side. They belonged to the future. Skorzeny did not win battles that changed the outcome of the Second World War. He did something quieter and more enduring. He forced everyone watching to understand that the margins mattered, that systems failed not only when overwhelmed, but when confronted by something they were never designed to stop. The gliders on the plateau lasted only minutes. The lesson lasted decades. After him, power moved differently. It traveled with heavier protection, greater secrecy, and persistent unease. Leaders no longer trusted geography. Armies no longer assumed distance equaled safety. Conflict no longer belonged exclusively to massed forces moving along predictable fronts. Skorzeny did not claim moral authority over that change. He did not frame it as progress or decline. He accepted it as reality, revealed early and at cost. History did not absolve him, but it did not erase him either. He remains a reminder that war is not only shaped by numbers and firepower, but by individuals willing to act where others believe action is impossible. That sometimes the most consequential moments do not arrive with bombardment, but with silence, altitude, and speed. Otto Skorzeny did not end wars. He did not save nations. He did not decide the fate of the world. He showed how easily the rules protecting power could be broken. Once shown, that knowledge could not be forgotten. And from that moment on, no mountain, no distance, and no assumption was ever quite enough again.